Super. Well, hello. I'm excited about this conversation. Welcome, everyone. Um, we're excited for the conversation with Sarah. We're going to just go through some basic housekeeping rules. Please don't hesitate to turn on your cameras. You will show up live on the live recording. This is being recorded. We're going to send you the link after the session. Don't hesitate to participate in the chat. This is an interactive conversation, and we're all here to add on to the conversation and have an interesting one. And then keep up with us on social at PowerToFly and subscribe to our channels. I'm excited to also introduce Zara, my colleague, and I'll pass it on to her to introduce herself and tell us a bit more about herself.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nahla. Again, hello, everyone. I know that there's some folks might be watching this live stream. I'm very excited to be here and have this important conversation with you all. So my name is Zara. I am on the DEIB team at Power2Fly. My title is Global DEIB Strategist and Trainer. I am proudly based out of Brooklyn in the US. Again, super excited to kind of have this conversation and dive into why it is really important that we're approaching DEI at our companies with that 360 degree approach. Again, we'll have lots of fun conversation and questions to kind of walk through today. But this is something that I'm very passionate about. I love what I do. I love speaking to other people about this. So I'm excited to kind of dive into this conversation.
Great, and we're happy to have you here. I forgot to introduce myself, I just noticed. So I'm Nahla from the sales team. It is quite early for me. I'm part of the EMEA APAC team, but I am currently in Mexico City and live streaming from Starbucks. So let's jump into the conversation, Zara, shall we?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, first question first things first, and first question, why is it important to implement DEI in your company or in a company?
Yeah, this is great. So first thing I really wanted to address here, I think it's interesting. There's so many different acronyms when it comes to speaking about this, right? So we have DEI, we have DEIB, I've also seen D and I, or I've seen DEIJ for justice. I've also seen IDEA, where it's inclusion, diversity, equity, access. So it's interesting because there's a lot of different approaches to this work. A lot of it, the foundation for a lot of it is very much, sorry about that, y'all. So a lot of the foundation for this work is similar. But again, like the different acronyms that folks kind of choose and that companies really choose speaks to what the priority is for them, right? So here, for instance, at Power2Fly, we use DEIB with the B being for belonging, because we not only prioritize like what a company might be doing, but we really also look at what's the impact on its employees from those actions, right? Like what is the impact on people's sense of belonging from those actions? So again, some companies, especially when we talk about like DEIJ, they really prioritize justice in their approach. Or for some companies that use IDEA, they really prioritize access in their approach. So I just kind of wanted to name that in case you're seeing a bunch of different acronyms and you're wondering like what the difference is. That's kind of like what the difference is. The work, a lot of the foundational understanding of it is the same, but again, the approach might be a little bit different. So let's talk about this 360 degree approach. So what we're really doing when we say that is we're talking about how do we support the whole person, right? Because oftentimes, historically, companies may not have done the most when it comes to supporting employees. Of course, we have exceptions that have prioritized this from the very beginning. But a lot of times, this sort of conversation and this sort of approach is a little bit of a newer thing for a lot of companies. And that's because a lot of it is due to what this pandemic has really shown us, right? These past few years have really shown us that people are no longer really settling to work at places where they feel like their health, their happiness is no longer the priority, right? And so what it's really done is forced a reckoning in a lot of different companies and industries who basically stand to lose employees if they don't start making some changes fast in championing and supporting their employees, right? So it's really important because, you know, we're in the midst of like the Great Resignation, right? Where a lot of employees, again, they're not settling to work at places where they feel like their needs are not being met or where they feel like they're not being prioritized. And so if companies are not prioritizing this work, you're going to lose employees to other companies that might be prioritizing this on a larger scale, right? So I'll just talk about belonging for a second, just because I know, like, again, at PowerToFly, that's something that we really focus heavily on. There has been so much research and so many studies conducted that have shown that when employees feel a greater sense of belonging, it has a huge impact on their productivity and on them remaining at the company, right? So like we've seen, when people feel like they belong, they're 6 times more engaged. There's a 56% increase in job performance, right? It has really measurable impact on people's productivity at a company. So the last thing I'll name here is that gone are the days where we can really demand that people leave parts of themselves like at the door, right? Also because like there is no door in a lot of cases anymore, right? Like people are working remote. So the very real things that are happening in the world are having an impact on people's health and mental health. So we need to make sure that if employees are really struggling like outside of work, that they feel like they're truly genuinely supported at work, right? That work isn't adding to their stress and trauma that they might already be dealing with. We want folks to actually enjoy coming to work, right? And if they feel like they can't bring important parts of themselves to work, that's a problem.
Yeah, I completely agree. And kind of what spoke to me in what you said is, since I speak to HR leaders all day long, is how competitive is the market out there? And you kind of want to keep your folks happy and keep them around, because, you know, it's going to cost you a lot if they don't.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So follow-up question on that, Zara, and I kind of want us to deep dive into what are the steps to have a successful 360 DEI approach, and how can we kind of avoid the pitfalls, right, when doing it, what comes into it, what to avoid, what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love this question because I think a lot of times people, especially companies that may not have been thinking about this previously, it can almost be overwhelming, right? Like, where do I start? What do I do? So let's dive into it. So first and foremost, a 360-degree DEI approach is all about holistically looking at the whole person, right? We were just talking about that in the last question, but also looking at what they might need to truly succeed and thrive, right? That means we cannot be operating off of assumptions. So that's like one pitfall that happens a lot of times when it comes to DEI work, is people assuming that you know what other folks need, right? Assumptions can be very dangerous. So we want to make sure that we're not operating off of any sort of assumptions. We need to be fully informed about what people at your company actually want and need, right? So that means that we need to proceed with first creating spaces and opportunities for employees to elevate their voice. A lot of times in DEI work in general, we're leading with the most underrepresented employees in mind, right? So I just want to name that again. What's really important in DEI work is that we're leading with the most underrepresented employees in mind. So back to the danger of assumption, right? We need to be careful in assuming what other people might need, particularly if we're not from those communities ourselves, right? So what do our most underrepresented employees need? And I shouldn't be operating off of assumptions, right? I should be creating the opportunities to actually hear from those employees directly. What do you all need to really thrive at the workplace? So we want to make sure that we're really building space and opportunities where all employees, particularly those from historically oppressed backgrounds, can share what they need to succeed and thrive within the workplace. Also, something else to keep in mind, people are unique, right? Like there's lots of nuances, there's lots of complexities when it comes to individuals. So we also want to keep in mind that one person doesn't speak for an entire group, right? Again, people have like individual needs. So which is why, again, as we're hearing from individuals and people at our companies directly, we should also be keeping in mind that folks are not representative of an entire category, right? Of an identity or anything like that. So we want to make sure we're keeping that in mind. We also want to make sure that people have different levels of opportunity to share their thoughts. So some folks may not feel comfortable, right, sharing their thoughts in like a public venue, for instance, whereas maybe some people would prefer like a one-on-one and having a conversation there to kind of ask like what, or kind of share what they need, right? So making sure that we have various opportunities for folks to kind of share their thoughts and their questions. So maybe, just some examples to throw out here. What I've seen a lot of companies do and what I recommend is a survey, right? So kind of just like asking folks, what do you all need? An anonymous survey, right? So people feel a little bit safer in sharing what they're thinking. Or you could do like a company town hall, right? Where people can kind of voice what their concerns are, what they need. Again, keeping in mind that that's not going to be the best route for everyone, right? So making sure that we have multiple avenues to kind of collect this information. The second big thing here is to understand that DEI work cannot live only in HR and operations. And I think this is a big one, right? For a lot of people, when we think about DEI, we immediately think of human resources or we think of people operations. But the danger here is that when you start siloing off the work like that, it starts to live in only one part of the company, right? Which, if we're really trying to create change across the company and prioritize people across the company, it can't just live in one corner of the company. It has to live with everyone and it has to live everywhere, right? So we need to make sure that it's integrated into every facet of the company, because we need to make sure that, like, again, everyone feels some level of investment in this work and in this priority. And then the final thing that I'll name here, again, I was just talking about it, but that buy-in is crucial at every level, right? So not just on the individual contributor level, but on the CEO level, sometimes on the board level, even if we can, right? Making sure that people are aligned and ready to really shift things. So I'm sure I'll expand on the buy-in part on a little bit of a later question, but I did want to make sure that I kind of named that here. Buy-in is going to be really important when we talk about like this approach.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think what speaks to me is that one person does not speak for an entire underrepresented group. That that hits home. But I guess because we keep learning every day about DI strategies, and there's a lot to say and to address and to explore. And I guess let's take a step back and kind of talk about what are some of the holistic strategies out there to implement this 360 DEI approach.
Yeah. Oh my God, I love this question. So again, I think like we kind of see why this is important, right? We've kind of like talked a little bit about that, but like now what can we do, right? That's like what this question really speaks to. So something that you'll quickly find in DEI work that you can't do a one size fits all approach, right? Like you just can't, because again, what one person might need is not what someone else might need, right? So keeping in mind that we can't have a one size fits all approach, it's not going to work. People are unique, right? And they have like various different needs, and we need to make sure that we have a multi-pronged approach with different initiatives, different programs that can really speak to the various things that your folks might be asking for, right? I was mentioning earlier, like doing a survey or doing a town hall, right? Like really gathering this intel from your folks, like what do they need? Now that you have that data, now you can kind of sift through it and figure out, okay, this is what our priorities are going to be, right? This is what we're going to focus on. So there's some of the steps that companies take, especially if you're in the beginning stages, right? I'll name a few here. I just want to name also that this is not an exhaustive list, right? This is kind of just some basic steps to get us started, right? Again, keeping in mind that every company is going to really have to tailor their approach depending on what their folks want, right? So just keeping that in mind. So the first one that I'd really name here is having a DEI council or committee, right? If you don't currently have one at your company, this is a group of passionate individuals who are really invested in leading and fueling DEI change at the company level. So this group can be really powerful if they're leveraged correctly to help inform company decision-making and direction. DEI councils, something I do want to flag here, they do need to be funded appropriately, right? And DEI council leads should also be compensated appropriately for their work, right? So something that we're very big on in DEI work in general, we often talk about is pay equity, right? So that also means that if people are doing this work, it is emotional labor, it is a lot of work. We shouldn't be expecting people to do it for free, right? So if we're thinking about creating a DEI council, keeping in mind like what is the compensation that's going to follow with that. Another big sort of area that a lot of companies focus on is ERGs. Now, what is an ERG? An ERG is an employee resource group. Some companies have them and they call them affinity groups. They may look like different things at different companies, but essentially these are typically groups that are oriented around a specific identity, right? So maybe ability or sexuality, for instance, right? So like it's groups of individuals that identify a certain way, and there's a group and a space that's available for them to really connect across that. Again, these are powerful groups that can be leveraged. Similar to the DEI Council, these are powerful groups that can really be leveraged to help inform company direction, company decision making, right? Like we should be leveraging these folks. And a lot of times that's something that I see happen often at companies where they're not really leveraging these groups and they're so powerful, right? There's passionate individuals that we're just not utilizing. Something else, again, similar to what I was saying about the DEI Council, we want to make sure that we're compensating ERG co-leads. We want to make sure that we're giving funding to employee resource groups to really have events and kind of continue to build that space. One question I get a lot is, should allies be a part of ERGs? And honestly, this question really varies, right? So you need to be able to hear what your folks want. So this is a great question to ask your employees, right? If we were to create employee resource groups, are allies something that we want to include in that space? In general, I would recommend no, like in general, just to maintain the safety of the space for folks from that identity. But I have definitely seen companies where people wanted allies in the space, right? So they accommodated that. And again, it shifted the space, but in the way that people want it, right? So that's why it's really important for us to actually listen to what our folks want. So that's another sort of strategy. I'll just quickly name a few others in case folks are like wondering. A professional development program, right? But not just for if folks want to move up in a company, right? What if folks don't want to move up in a company? What if they want to change departments? What if they want to grow in their own role? A lot of times we see companies build out professional development programs that are only about moving people up. But what if people are happy where they are, right? Like we need to be able to also shift our mindset of what we think of when we think of professional development. We want to make sure we have trainings and education, right? So people can continue to learn and grow. We also want to make sure, and we'll talk about this later, but we want to make sure we have inclusive hiring and retention practices, right? We want to make sure that we're getting diverse candidates and people from diverse backgrounds in the door, but that we're also keeping them there, right? That we're helping them grow and succeed and thrive. So these are just like a few examples of the different types of strategies. Again, it's imperative that you're actually surveying your folks and having conversations with your employees to see what they actually want. But these are a few of the like different examples of strategies when it really comes to DEI work.
Great, so much to think about there. I think like immediately what I think about next is, okay, we've done a bunch of these things, or we implemented what we needed to, or how do we then measure the success? That makes sense. And who is in charge of measuring it? Because yeah, you want to know that the steps that you made are working, right? Are having the correct impact and the desirable impact.
Yeah, this is a great question. You need to be able to set goals, right? You need to be able to set goals that are really informed by what you discovered and that are able to kind of track your progress, right? So oftentimes I recommend setting SMART goals, right? Where you, again, are listening to what your folks want and you're setting goals based off of that. Also that you're communicating your progress on these goals. A lot of times I see companies kind of set these goals and then no one hears about them again, right? Like we have no idea what's going on with them. So making sure that we're widely communicating what our progress is company-wide. We want to make sure that like this is something, again, what I was referring to earlier, we don't want this to just live with one team or with one person, right? We need everyone to really be invested in this. So if people are not aware of like what the journey is, or how can we be on the journey together, right? So we need to make sure that we are really explicitly communicating our progress on these different goals. Also making sure that we have follow-up opportunities for people to share feedback. Something else that we don't want to do is have like one survey that got sent out once, like 5 years ago, to kind of measure what's going on and then nothing, right? Or one town hall that was hosted 2 years ago and there was no follow-up, right? We actually want to make sure that we have consistent touch points where people can share what they're continuously looking for, but also respond to changes that might be happening at the company, right? Let's say your company starts an employee resource group program, right? 6 months later, we want to hear from folks. How are those programs going? What could we do better to strengthen these programs, right? So making sure that we have consistent touch points that people can really speak to the company and continue to learn for. Something that like we're big on at PowerToFly, I know there was a few questions around like what PowerToFly does, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later, but something that we are big on at PowerToFly is really making sure that we have a DEI strategy built out for a company, because we know when you have a vision, right? That's important. That's one step. But it's not the whole thing, right? Because when you have a well thought out strategy that has clear, measurable goals and calls to action, right? That's a whole different level than when you just have a vision. And so that's why it's actually very important to have a strategy. Now, whether you bring on PowerToFly to help build out that strategy, or, let's say you build out a DEI council and you're having them really lead on this, whatever it is, you got to have people leading the charge who are bought in, who are invested in the importance of this work, right? Like, I'm going to keep coming back to that because it's very difficult to lead this work on your own when people at your company are not bought into this work. We have to make sure that we're really building in the investment on all different levels. And those people who are passionate about this work, those are the ones who should be in charge of building out this approach.
Yeah, I hear pushback and I hear buy-in, and based on the conversation I have every day, a lot of the times, like sadly, or I don't want to say sadly, I don't know what's the right word here, we come back and say, the market is competitive. We just need folks through the door. We don't have the budgets to allocate it, or it's harder to get the budgets approved. And I guess, what should we do to show the CEO, the leadership, the importance of a 360 approach to DEI, and how do we really get that leadership team on board? Because I guess because that is one of the major pushbacks that I always hear team give me back.
Yeah, I love this question. And I actually often get this question as well. So it's all about building a business case for DEI. That's basically what you have to do, right? Luckily, there has been so much data and research that's already available on this. There have been a lot of studies that have been conducted on this work and the impact that it really has at the company level, right? So that's the good news, right? There's already things that are out there that you can really tap into. Now, what's the challenge here is that you also want to make sure you're bringing in direct thoughts and feedback from your people as well, right? It's not just about data and research externally. It's also about bringing your actual employees' thoughts and feedback. So this is why I love the survey idea, right? Because you get a bunch of data that you can then sort of sift through and bring back to your leadership team, right? And actually say, hey, so something that I see happen often is that leadership thinks one thing is happening at the company, right? Their employees are thinking one way, but what's actually happening and what employees are feeling and experiencing is different, right? And so a lot of times when you have results from a survey to actually say, hey, that's not what's happening here, right? Like, here is the data to prove it. It's almost like a moment of like surprise or even shock, right? For some leaders who are just like, I had no idea that like my employees were struggling or they were thinking this way. And that's where that data is so important, where yes, external data is super important to kind of show in general why this work is important. But let me also tell you what's happening at our company right now, right? It's a little bit of a reality check for individuals. And sometimes that's the reality check that CEOs and leadership teams really need to be like, oh, I guess this is something we got to focus on because we didn't realize. So that's something that I push really hard for. You got to build that business case with both lots of data that exists already and making sure that you're collecting that data internally as well to really get your leadership team and your CEO to see this work is actually really important.
Absolutely. I think we covered like the how to do it. And I want to kind of ask you to deep dive into the why. So if we don't have it, how does the lack of DEI hiring and retention policies affect your team?
Yeah. And I just want to also name, this is, we're diving into one part of it, right? We're diving into the hiring and retention part of it, which is a very important part. So I'm happy to talk about this. So I think, again, something that we at PowerToFly talk about is this concept of an inclusion house, right? So it's this house where we're getting people in the door, right? Where especially like, let's say really talented candidates that come from diverse backgrounds. But then once they get inside the house, they realize that like, there's no support system here. I don't have a couch to sit on. I don't have food to eat. I don't feel like I can actually survive here. And then they leave out the back door, right? So that's something that we actually need to be very mindful of and that I often talk to companies about, because a lot of companies recognize that, okay, we need to look at our hiring policies, but you're doing a huge disservice to folks if you're not also looking at your retention policies, because it doesn't help if you're getting people in the door if they're just going to leave out the back door a few months later, right? So we need to make sure that we're actually looking at both of these, both the hiring and the retention policies at the same time. So thinking about the hiring policy side of it, when we are not intentionally holistically evaluating candidates, we stand to really miss out on some great folks, right? Because maybe we're utilizing like super rigid guidelines. Now, for instance, and I've seen this happen a lot, let's say that your company is prioritizing candidates who attend certain colleges, right? What are we really saying there? What we're saying is that only those folks who many times, by the way, have had some level of access, whether it's to education or to wealth, right? Not always, but often. What we're saying is that only those folks who went to those colleges are considered top tier candidates, right? But something I want to name here, where someone went to school has no guarantee of how effective and successful that they will be at certain roles or positions, right? We started off this conversation talking about the dangers of assumption, right? A lot of times what goes hand in hand with assumption is biases, right? And so when we are assuming that certain candidates who have gone to certain colleges are going to be a certain way, now we're also leaning on biases that we have, right? And so we need to ensure that we're not approaching like any sort of hiring or recruiting policies with these biases on what the ideal candidate looks like, or maybe where they come from, right? Rather, we want to focus on who would be the best person for this role, right? What skill sets might they need, both hard and soft. Especially as we move towards a more remote world, those soft skill sets are going to be so important. What does relationship building look like for this individual? What is their conflict management skills, right? Beyond just their hard skills in a role. So we need to really reevaluate how are we looking at candidates and what are we really looking at, right, from our candidates. When we don't explicitly focus on unlearning a lot of the things that society has conditioned us to believe about the ideal worker, what we're doing is we're continuing to perpetuate the same process that eventually weeds out great diverse candidates during this process, right? So we need to make sure that we're questioning not only ourselves and our own biases, but questioning the processes that we're using, right, to bring in these candidates and to really evaluate them. Now, let's talk about the retention side for a second. Let's say we do hire some awesome candidates from diverse backgrounds, right? What is going to keep them at your company? Because what we're not trying to do is sell people a lie about their workplace, right? We don't want to tell people we are such a supportive workplace where we encourage diversity, we value diversity, and then we get people in the door and they're like, I don't feel supported. I don't actually see this, right? So we want to make sure that as we're focusing on the hiring side, we're also focusing on the retention side. We need to make sure that we proactively have policies in place that will help those folks feel supported and stay, right? Again, it doesn't help if we're hiring really great candidates and we're losing them a few months later because they're not feeling supported or they don't really see opportunities to grow, right? Long story short, when we don't have these types of policies in place, we will continue to have staff that looks, acts, and thinks the same, right? And what we do when we have staff that looks and acts and thinks the same, we miss out on crucial creativity and innovation that really follows diverse teams. There have been studies done that show when you have a more diverse team, you are more creative and you are more innovative. We miss out on those opportunities when we continue to hire the same types of folks.
Absolutely. I want to give a shout out to Shiva on LinkedIn, who said, yes, this is so true in Spain. That there are, some folks that only hire from some elite universities. I have a similar story. This speaks to me because I've been offered less money just because I didn't go to the right school. And young me was very devastated by that. But yeah, thank you for the insight, Sarah. I guess from your experience from meeting a lot of folks and working with a lot of companies on consulting and the DEI holistic approach, what are the demands of the employees of today, or specifically underrepresented employees?
Yeah, that's great. And no, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm really hoping for a day where that doesn't happen anymore, because that is devastating. Like, what does where you went to college say about who you are as a person and what your potential is? It doesn't say anything. It just says, did you have access to an education that would have led you down that path? Did you have access to wealth that could have gotten you there? You know, it doesn't speak to, and this is what we mean by we have to reevaluate how we are holistically looking at candidates, because that should not be happening anymore. It can't. It can't. We miss out on awesome. Nala, you're wonderful, right? Like that job, that company missed out on you, you know, and like that's the reality, right? So how are we making sure that we are not continuing those same mistakes now in today's day and age? Because now people are understanding that is not the way that things can be done anymore. So I just wanted to thank you for kind of naming that and bringing that into the space, because you'd be surprised how many folks have had to deal with that, right? Like we don't talk enough about it, but hopefully my goal and my dream is that one day those stories are not happening anymore. All right, so back to your question, right? So what are the demands that employees are kind of making, especially employees from underrepresented backgrounds are making of their employers? So I mentioned earlier, right? Like, again, PowerToFly kind of takes the belonging approach. And I think what might be helpful here, because belonging can be kind of like a little bit of a vague, abstract concept. I want to break it down a little bit to like the pieces and kind of explain how that lands and how employees kind of think about it. So the major components of this idea of belonging, right? It's when employees feel welcomed, included, valued, and connected, right? And alongside all of those, also when they feel psychologically safe, right? So let's break this down a little bit, each piece. So when people feel welcomed, right? We're talking about diversity and representation, right? When we talk about diversity, we're talking about both inherent characteristics, right? Like identity, what you might have been born with, but also acquired characteristics, right? Like the way you think, your work experience, all of that, education, right? So when we talk about employees feeling welcomed, right? Diversity is welcome, representation is there, right? What about included? When employees feel included, they feel like their thoughts, their opinions are sought out by people, right? It's sought out by the company. What about valued? Their thoughts and opinions aren't just sought out, they're actually valued, right? So it's not just, oh, I'm going to ask Nala's like ideas on this thing and then ignore them, right? It's actually, Nala, I value you and I value what you think. So I'm going to ask you your thoughts and opinions, and I'm going to act on that, right? Nala is more than just her role, right? And her differences, like how me and her might think differently, we might be from different backgrounds. Those things are seen as an asset, right? So that's where that value piece comes in. Again, when we have people who look, think the same, act the same, we miss out on these differences, and those differences are so valuable, right? Now let's talk about connected. I feel like I'm a part of something bigger, right? I feel like I'm a part of a team. I'm part of a larger project, right? I feel connected to something larger than me. And that brings us to the final piece, which is psychological safety, which is something I just want to name here. Psychological safety looks different for everyone, right? So I just want to be very clear. It's what one person might view helps them feel safe is not the same thing that someone else might view. But what it is when people feel safe, and I shouldn't use the word safe to explain what psychological safety is. So it's when people feel like they can make mistakes, they can push back, they can challenge things without fear of punishment or humiliation, right? That's really what psychological safety is. So these are the things that employees are demanding of their employers to help them feel all of these various things. So I spent a little bit of time breaking down like this concept of belonging, because I think it really helps when you break it down to kind of see, okay, so this is what employees are actually asking for and demanding of their employers, right? So what are the different pieces? What are the different things that we can really offer to speak to these multiple areas, right? So just to give some examples, employees are asking for remote or hybrid work environments, right? They're asking for more flexibility in where they're working. They're looking for more inclusive health benefits, right? Especially with all the things that are happening in the world right now. Again, I'm based in the US, right? The health benefit aspect is very crucial for a lot of folks. So they're holding their employers accountable to offering more inclusive health benefits. They're looking for more cross-culturally sensitive language and conversations. Again, as we move towards an increasingly remote world, we're going to have people from multiple backgrounds. What is the work that's being done here to really bridge understanding across any gaps that might exist, right? This is what employees are looking for. These are just a few examples. Again, what are your employees looking for? You need to find that information out. It's crucial to find that information out. Don't just go off of what I'm saying, right? These are just examples. You need to make sure that you're prioritizing, listening to your actual employees and hearing what they have to say. So you got to make sure that you have those venues of gathering that information from your folks. A big thing that I've been hearing from the past year for a lot of different companies, they're wanting to build connection, right? So they're asking, what can we do to build connection with teammates in a remote environment? Something I want to name here, that doesn't just happen, right? You have to put the work in, you have to put intentionality behind it to make sure that these spaces are being built. So a lot of times what companies are doing is they're relying on people, on their employees to kind of self-organize, right? Put together a happy hour, for instance, right? First of all, a lot of times a happy hour is happening after work hours, right? People have other responsibilities. A lot of times people don't want to be working past their work hours. So now you're missing out on a large chunk of people because of the time that you're organizing. Build this into the workday. Also, don't rely on people to take on extra work to organize these things, right? Make sure, let's say you have an ERG, let's say you have a DEI council, have those folks organized to build these events, because again, we're hoping that those folks will be compensated for the work that they're doing, right? So making sure that we are prioritizing this and not just relying on people's free emotional labor to create these spaces and these conversations, but actually compensating people for this work. Because again, it's not just going to happen. If you're sitting around waiting for employees to organize this, it's difficult. People are dealing with a lot of very real world trauma that's happening. You can't be relying on people. So companies need to take the initiative to actually make sure, leadership needs to take the initiative to actually make sure that we're prioritizing building these spaces and prioritizing building these connections. So I'll stop there. I know I said a lot, but I'm very passionate about this.
Oh my gosh. Amen to all of that. Snapping my fingers to psychological safety. Yeah, from conversations, again, I have with like folks from my environment, because we come, I'm from Beirut, Lebanon, I'm from the Middle East. You kind of don't want to speak out because you're rocking the boat and you're jeopardizing your position, and you're not 100% sure that it's going to be well received.
Yeah.
So you'd rather not go there and not speak out.
Yep. And there's that fear, right? You don't feel psychologically safe to speak up or to push back but what happens now, Nala? Your feedback, your thoughts, they're being silenced, right? Like you don't feel like you can actually share what you're thinking or what you're doing. And now the company or the culture or wherever you are, you're missing out on this crucial thoughts, on these crucial like opinions that people have, because they don't feel safe enough to speak up. And again, what you need for safety might look different than what I need for safety, but someone needs to be prioritizing finding that information out, right? What does Zara need to feel psychologically safe versus what does Nala need to feel psychologically safe? All right, we got that information. Let's make it happen. Let's figure out how we can shift things.
So let's figure out how we can shift things. What are the key areas that we should focus on, Zara?
Yeah. This is a great question. Again, like a lot of companies, especially if you're on the front end of figuring out like what does a DEI strategy look like? What should I be focusing on? So there's a few key areas I would say that tend to be like the hot topic areas, right, when it comes to DEI strategy. So the first one is hiring and recruiting, right? We were just talking about that. When you continue to have employees who all look the same, think the same, you're missing out on a lot of diversity of opinions, on a lot of creativity, on a lot of innovation, right? So we want to make sure that we're looking at our hiring and our recruiting practices. We also, like, depending on what your company does, of course, looking at your marketing and branding, right? Like people want to buy products and invest in products where people like them are in the ads, are reflected, you know what I mean, in like the actual marketing and the branding of a product. So that's one place that a lot of companies, they're not thinking about it, or maybe they are thinking about it and they're just thinking, oh, diversity looks like one thing, right? So again, I'm in the US where race and gender tend to be like the top two diversity metrics that are really like focused on, right? So a lot of times in ads, you might see like people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds and people of various genders. But that's it, right? What about people who are disabled? Why are we not including them in advertisements, right? Things like that. Like we need to be thinking beyond just the sort of superficial level and actually thinking about on a deeper level, how are we making sure that we are showing diversity in our marketing and branding? Company culture is a super important one, right? We were just talking about psychological safety. Do people feel safe at work? Do people feel like they can be themselves at work? Do people feel like they have to leave parts of themselves at the door? If so, why do they feel that way? What are the things that we need to really start shifting for that to change, right? Again, something I want to name here, it's hard to say like what are key areas for your company, because you got to first figure out what's happening at your company right now, right? So I'm going to keep bringing us back to that, because we don't want to, we mentioned this in the beginning, we've mentioned it a few times, don't operate off of assumptions. You got to figure out exactly what's happening at your company before you start taking action. You have to make sure you're listening directly to your employees on what they want and that you're acting on that, right? So again, a lot of the examples and things I give, please like listen, but also be aware that that may not apply directly to your company. You have to make sure that you're finding out that information proactively.
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned that we tend to only focus on gender. For example, we have a summit coming up here at PowerToFly for invisible and visible disabilities and neurodiversity. I have chronic depression and anxiety, and I think it's not spoken about enough. So beyond gender, what are the other DEI metrics that we should be looking at, right? Yeah. Because we are kind of binary or kind of, limited. I don't know. I'll let you speak to it. I'm not the expert you are.
No, it's okay. I understand what you were saying. First of all, thank you, Nala, for even sharing that and being so like vulnerable to kind of trust us all with that information. I think, again, I'm really happy that you felt safe enough to kind of disclose that information, right? How do we make sure we're building environments where everyone feels, if they want to, feel safe enough to disclose that information, right? Because that's the other thing I also want to name here is we're not trying to force people into doing things that they're not comfortable doing, right? Whether that's having certain conversations or sharing certain information. But what we do want to do is make sure that we're creating opportunities for people to do so if they want, right? So it's never about forcing people to be a certain way. It's about creating the opportunity that if they want to, they can, right? So that's something I also wanted to kind of clarify. So Nala, back to your question about like different DEI metrics, right? There's so many. So as I mentioned before, especially in the US, we're very much focused on like race and gender, right? But when you look at different geographic locations across the world, the diversity metrics look very different, right? So a lot of times race and ethnicity doesn't even make it in like the top 5 diversity metrics, right? Around the world. That's a very specific sort of focus on the US, for instance, right? So you need to take geographic location into account when you're creating like diversity metrics. So just for example, right, like in APAC, for instance, I know like religion and caste are like 2 metrics that may not carry as much importance in other areas of the world, but in that area, religion and caste are like 2 big diversity metrics, right? So we have to make sure that we're looking at like where we are in the world and being aware of like culturally what are the diversity metrics that are happening. But some other examples here, right? I mentioned earlier that diversity is both inherent characteristics as well as acquired characteristics. So on the inherent side, right, some identity examples are ability, right? Are folks able-bodied or are they disabled? Is it an invisible or visible disability, like you were saying, Nala, right? Neurodiversity, right? We have a new sort of awareness of folks who are neurodivergent, right? Which means their brains work in a way that's different than what we've typically been conditioned to think is normal, right? So again, like neurodivergent folks bring so many amazing skill sets and like strengths to the workplace. How are we making sure that we're really, again, focusing on bringing in more neurodivergent folks into our teams because they strengthen our teams, right? Class is another one. Sexuality, right? These are all different types of diversity metrics that we can be looking at. But beyond just that, let's also look at acquired characteristics, right? What's the cultural diversity that's happening? What is our worldview diversity that's happening, right? our work style diversity. There's so many different ways that, again, people from the exact same identity like metrics might be totally different in the workplace. We cannot assume, right, that one person who's from one group is going to behave or want the same exact things from as someone else from that same group. So these are all things that we need to be like mindful of, right? So these are different examples of like diversity metrics and DEI metrics that we can be looking at, but being mindful that geographic locations in the world will have different diversity metrics.
Absolutely. I always say, like, because EMEA and APAC is the territory I handle, kind of, and I always say within the same country, sometimes within the same city, diversity can look
100%.
very different.
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, even in the US, right? Like I'm on the East Coast, West Coast. There may be different diversity metrics happening there. Absolutely. That's a great point, Nala.
Yeah. So, which leads us all to how PowerToFly can support in this DI journey, especially from the lens of your team, the DEIB team, who is the core team. So can you speak a little bit about the work that you do along with the team?
Yeah, no, I can talk about this all day. So what we're really trying to do at PowerToFly is shift a lot of people's mindsets, right? When it comes to these conversations and when it comes to this work, because people don't know what you don't know, right? So how are we creating opportunities for people to really learn and push their own thinking? So we do that in a variety of ways because we also recognize that not everyone learns the same way, right? And so we want to be mindful that, for instance, someone who might thrive in a training type of setting may not thrive in a conversational type of setting, right? Because a training is a little bit more formal content delivery. You're learning a little bit more foundational knowledge. Whereas in a conversational setting, you're really kind of learning from someone's lived experience, right? Maybe you're hearing directly about what it was like for them growing up, being who they are, right? So you're kind of learning, it's still learning, but it's a different type of learning, right? So we are very mindful that people learn in different ways. And so we cannot, again, going back to this idea of we can't have a one size fits all approach. We can't. So this is where PowerToFly really comes in, because we're all about having different types of services that we kind of partner with companies on, also depending on where the company is at, right? Because different companies are at different levels of the DEI journey. Some companies might be at the very front, some companies might be further along, right? So we are, again, mindful that one size fits all does not work for DEI at all, right? And so when we're thinking about how can PowerToFly really support folks, so we have our trainings, obviously, right, which are kind of, they're built on a pathway. So we really move people through 4 different pillars on a specific topic. We're moving people through understanding, awareness, action, and accountability on the same topic, right? Because again, a lot of questions we get after a training, especially if we do a one-off training, is what's next, right? So we're recognizing that people are hungry for this information. They want to learn on a deeper level. So one-off trainings are not cutting it anymore for a lot of folks. So the way that we really orient our trainings are on a larger arc of learning so that people are able to really dive in deeper into ideas and into concepts than they previously might have been able to, right? So we have our trainings. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, our service where we actually build out a 3-year DEI plan and a strategy with a company, right? Because again, recognizing that DEI vision is important, but it's not everything, right? You need to have the goals. You need to have the larger sort of strategy of how are we moving and making progress towards this. And that's where we come in. We partner with companies over a span of a few months. We have a whole process about how we really dive into evaluating where a company is currently at, seeing where the gaps exist, and then creating a strategy to really mitigate those gaps, right? So that's another one of our more popular services to really help companies, because again, it can be overwhelming, right? If you're thinking about where do I start? Oh my gosh, there's so much to do. There is, let us come in and help you, right? And another big sort of product or service that we really offer and partner with companies on is Courageous Conversations, right? Which right now we have a campaign going with campaign pricing as well if folks are interested. But a Courageous Conversation it's almost like this, right? It's like a fireside chat where we have 2 individuals talking about someone's lived experience. Now, in this case, we're talking about larger DEI work, right? It's not exactly the same, but in a fireside chat, for instance, Nala would be asking me about my personal lived experience with all of my identities, and I would be kind of sharing what I've learned and tips and tricks and on specific concepts, right? So I could be talking about allyship. I could be talking about, again, like a variety of different conversational topics. During Pride, we did a bunch of different courageous conversations on folks that might have different sexuality or might be of different genders than a lot of what's considered the norm, right? So expanding people's thinking on these topics. And like you said, storytelling is a huge part of DEI, right? So courageous conversations is another type of service that we really offer, where people are able to learn through hearing someone else's experiences, right? So less of that training type of setting and more of that conversational setting. So this is where PowerToFly is like super adaptable. We just want people to learn and grow, right? And like we will work with companies to figure out what does that look like for you and your company. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, absolutely. I can attest to that. It's all about meeting the teams where they are, right? We can't say that enough. And every company is very different. I think Afua, if I'm not butchering your name or if I'm saying it wrong, I apologize, is asking you, Zara, would you consider race, gender, ability to be metrics versus diversity categories? Because when she thinks metrics, she defaults to things that are measurable and tied to some kind of ROI impact on business.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. And thanks for flagging that, Nala. So it's actually both, right? So a lot of times, I think where companies fall into a pitfall is where they try to look at diversity metrics as just a box to check, right? Without understanding the larger sort of impact on the business. It's not just about checking the box on, okay, we have this many folks of color. Okay, we have this many neurodivergent folks. It's why does that matter, right? And that's the part that a lot of companies, they fail to make that connection, where it's not just about checking a box. It's about understanding that the more diversity we have at a company, the more innovative and creative our teams are going to be, the stronger the product is that we're going to create, right? Like, I think it's that sort of further understanding that's really missing there. And so what ends up happening is a lot of folks limit diversity categories to metrics in the sense of just measuring how many folks at their company can check this box without understanding actually it's way more than that. And there's a much more holistic foundation underneath that, right? Where it's not just checking a box for compliance purposes. It's understanding that the more folks that we have in these different categories, the stronger our company is going to be as a result, right? And that's where the impact on the ROI and the business comes into play. So Afua, just so you know, there have been studies done that show the impact of having diverse teams on a company, right? So that's where, again, you have these diversity like sort of categories that are impacting like the metrics of a company and the ROI of a company. So I would recommend you look into that, but that all goes back into building that business case for a DEI. Like these numbers, this information lives out there, right? There's no reason why we can't be leveraging it to understand and push our own companies to see that this is way more than just checking a box. This is actually making sure, first of all, that we are actually producing the strongest product or making the most impact that we possibly can, but also that we are setting ourselves up as a leader in our industry. Because again, we are in the midst of a great resignation. People are not settling for companies anymore that are not prioritizing these things, right? So it is about the company having sort of like maximizing its impact, but it's also about who is the company actually going to attract. If we are not prioritizing this, we're going to miss out on great candidates.
Thank you, Zara. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Do we have any other questions that we can cover? Paloma, is there anything on LinkedIn from our LinkedIn folks? Okay, so Zara, before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts? I want to say I'm very thankful for this conversation. You're a delight to listen to, and I love being your teammate, if I may say, on a public forum.
I love being your teammate too, Nala. No, yeah, I mean, I think final thoughts, I've been kind of echoing it throughout, so I'll just kind of like sum up a few of them here. Don't operate off of assumptions. You have to have a very real thorough assessment of where your company is currently at, and you have to be listening to what your employees want. 2, DEI strategy and approach is going to look different for every company. So please don't be looking at what another company is doing and just mirroring that exactly. That company may be doing some great things that potentially some of those pieces may be applicable to your company, not all, right? So again, being mindful that DEI approach and strategy looks very different. The third one is when we're pulling in diverse candidates, that's amazing. We got to make sure that we're keeping them. We got to make sure that we're retaining them, right? So ensuring that the retention policies are also there. And then finally, I would also say, in general, like DEI work is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And I think a lot of times, like companies and people kind of approach this work and are like, okay, we did it. And it's like, no, it's ongoing. It is forever ongoing. And we learn new information every day. So we have to make sure that we are on this journey together and we're in it for the long haul, because this is not a one and done type of scenario. This is a team effort. It's going to require everybody on board. We need people invested and bought in at every level. And we need to be like ready for the long journey ahead. But it's a fun journey and it's an important journey, and we have to be prioritizing this. So those are kind of my final thoughts for everyone. I just want to say thank you so much for being here and for listening to me kind of talk a lot. I'm very passionate about this, obviously, but these are really important conversations to have. So just a big thank you to everyone for being engaged and for being here.
Absolutely. We appreciate you all, and we hope to see you soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nala. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a